Hello, my name is Chris Conlon. I'm a student at WashU, and this is my video report overviewing Mutable Cube World games and the software engineering challenges they present. Mutable Cube World games are a new and lucrative genre of computer games, but there's a lot of confusion about them that I feel I need to eliminate. My main points are, Mutable Cube World games are a big opportunity, but they are really tricky to program and develop. But powerful solutions to these particular problems can be found, and the success or failure of the Mutable Cube World game genre, it really depends on customers, developers, and investors understanding the nature of these problems and their solutions. I designed this video with three audiences in mind. The first audience is people in the non-technical fields of the games industry, so they can get some understanding about why things are the way they are. The second is for people who are just interested in this topic, or people who play computer games themselves. And the last group is people like me, who are into sort of software development and design. They can either get a lot or very little out of this video depending on their level of experience. This video doesn't really go into depth too much about the programming topics, but if you aren't familiar with game programming, you may learn a lot. This video is going to start simple, then get more technical as time goes on. I'm going to be skipping over some things. A lot of things I'll describe in a simplified form to make them easy to understand. Please note for this video that I am not a professional game developer or a die-hard Minecraft fan or a member of the community. I'm just reporting. Part 1. Mutable what who? So, Mutable Cube World game is a term that I made up, in the absence of any really suitable word. It's a new and very promising type of computer game. The easiest way for me to explain what it is with an example, and I'll use the most prominent example out there. Minecraft is a computer game developed by a single Swedish programmer who goes by the name of Markus Persson. There's a lot of things that one can admire about Minecraft. It's an unprecedented hit with sales figures that are comparable to the Call of Duty games. In addition to its strong sales, its success has played a role in the introduction of a new financing model for computer games and other media. It's sort of a small cultural product right now, and some people have been playing it consistently for as much as 4 years now. The gameplay of Minecraft is pretty interesting. The game world is made up entirely of meter-sized cubes. The game gives the players the ability to add or remove cubes to this game world. When the player removes a cube, it's called mining, and when the player puts one down, it's called crafting. Generally, when a player explores the world and fights monsters, he or she is rewarded with an increased ability to move the cubes around. Now, here's the most important bit. The ability to construct and destruct is not a mini-game separate from the rest of the activities of the game. Instead, it's an integral component. Players can build bridges to cross rivers, or dig tunnels to get through mountains, and they can construct walls to keep monsters out. From a programming standpoint, there's absolutely no distinction made between the physical forms which are made by the player and the physical forms which the game starts out with. This is essentially what makes Minecraft unique. It's what establishes it as the first Mutable Cube World game, and it's why other games haven't successfully imitated it yet. Mutable Cube World games, or MCGs, have several things going for them, and as a commercial or artistic venture, you could do a lot worse than to make one. An MCG can really be a lot of fun because it hits that creative spark that all human beings have. When done right, these games can be as emotionally satisfying as games with hundreds of times their budget. Mutable Cube World games are perfect for smaller development teams because the game worlds, rather than being handcrafted by artists, are generated on the fly using software. Therefore, you don't really need as many artists as you would for a typical 3D title. An MCG can be really massive. Minecraft, for example, has caves that go down 100 meters in depth, and the horizontal size of the world is essentially infinite. MCGs can be also a really diverse genre, so if you make one, you don't have to worry about it being the exact same thing as your competitors. The makers of MCGs can really get creative about the gameplay and the setting and the audience for their game, and play around with the core idea. Lastly, there's no doubt in my mind about this, a Mutable Cube World game could be a money-making machine. Minecraft sold incredibly well, and has a really impressive player retention rate. A Mutable Cube World game that took a free-to-play or massively multiplayer model would very quickly pay back its development costs. Now, I don't mean to geek out too much, but I do need to hone in a point right now that MCGs are outliers. They feel different than other types of games. The way to develop them is different from other types of games, and the business models they'll be able to employ are going to be different than other types of games. They're outliers. So, let's do it. Let's do it right now. Let's make a Mutable Cube World game. Obviously, if Notch made Minecraft in 2 years, then me and 4 other people can make a superior version in a few months. See, blocks are really simple for a computer to draw, right? And then instead of using lousy Java for the game, which is obviously a bad idea, I'll instead use DirectX or C++ or an advanced game engine like Unreal or Unity to inject it with lots of visual eye candy. Making this will be a piece of cake. This brings me to part 2, not a piece of cake. Because Minecraft looks like something straight out of the 90s, it's pretty easy to think that a Mutable Cube World game would be easy to program. But what if I told you that dozens of programmers have attempted to make MCGs and failed? You can see a strong example of the perils of making an MCG by taking a look at 2 Mutable Cube World games that were once highly anticipated. Both games are being made by small studios, both games are made in Unity, and both games are promising to take the core idea of Minecraft and make something even better. And both games got a really optimistic early reaction. Each one has been crowdfunded for a lot of money, meaning that there were a lot of people willing to make advanced purchases on these in-development titles. Starforge got $100,000 advance from Indiegogo, and Yog Ventures got $500,000 from Kickstarter. Unfortunately, from a technical standpoint, both of these games are ending up miles south of their expectations. In the time I spent playing Starforge, I saw the game progressively run slower and less smoothly as I steadily laid down blocks to construct things. Before I had even placed down enough blocks to constitute a building, the game had slowed down to an unplayable degree. This is an issue that I don't think will be fixed in later development. Yog Ventures, on the other hand, also has some problems. It's running many months behind schedule. It's plagued by poor graphics, glitchy gameplay, and very long load times. The problem that both of these games have in common is that their developers severely underestimated the software engineering challenges that come with a Mutable Cube World game. Because in most games, a more powerful graphics system usually results in more detailed 3D models, it's easy to think that there's no way to technologically improve upon Minecraft. But this video will be focusing on technical improvements that do not even touch the underlying aesthetic of the game. Key to the performance problems of Minecraft is the sheer number of blocks that a Mutable Cube World game involves. More blocks means more work for the computer. Now, everyone should recognize this equation from middle school. The larger the surface area of the world, and the deeper the world is, the larger the volume of it. And that means the more number of cubes. And there's only so many cubes that the computer hardware can handle. So let's take a look at these limitations as they currently stand. If you had a world height of 100 meters and used 1 byte for every cube, here's what things would sort of look like. and this is more or less reflected in the performance limitations of Minecraft. The memory of a typical computer, about a gigabyte, could hold a 3 kilometer by 3 kilometer area. A typical hard disk could hold 10,000 square kilometers. But the real limitation is in the process of rendering, which is where we get a computer to draw a 3D scene using a digital description of it. And currently, we can only represent a square kilometer area on screen. And this creates a constraint called draw distance. Draw distance is a visual phenomena in computer games that comes from hardware limitations. A computer needs to render, again, in other words, draw, what the player sees in a very short time span. Typically, this time period is around 33 milliseconds, enough so that there are 30 images every second, enough to create the illusion of motion. When images are rendered this fast, we call it real-time rendering. Now, when you are in a game world that has so much stuff to draw, there's no way that you can do it all in that short time frame. So many games limit themselves to only drawing things that are within a certain distance from the player. This is called the draw distance, and when a draw distance is noticeable, it's called fog. The faster the game runs, the greater the draw distance is. Here are two games which are known for having short draw distances: Grand Theft Auto 3 for the PlayStation 2 and Minecraft. Now, as you can see by looking at this footage of Grand Theft Auto 5, which is coming out this fall, draw distances can be overcome with improvements to both hardware and software. But let's take a second to talk about why draw distance is important. I mean, it's not like every single game needs to look like a 3D Hollywood movie, right? Well, draw distance, far from being something that just affects the visual look of a game, has some impacts on the gameplay of the game. So, prominent landmarks don't feel as prominent, it's harder to navigate around the world, and the player's journey through the game world feels like less of an adventure and more of a slog through a misty swamp. So how much draw distance would you need for an MCG? That's sort of a tough question to answer, but let's take a look at the upper limits. In an MCG, many players, especially in multiplayer games, will make city-sized constructions, and I'm pretty sure that they would love to be able to see their entire construction with just one view. So what I'm about to show you is two separate representations of a world made by players in Minecraft. This one's been modeled after a city from the book and TV show Game of Thrones. First, here's some in-game footage of the city. It looks pretty good. But compare it to this image. This image was made with an external program which loads up Minecraft worlds and creates images from them with incredibly high fidelity. It takes a very long time for them to make these images, about 2 days. But the final image, in addition to looking really nice, has a draw distance of around 2 kilometers. What this allows us to see is things like the big castle or that giant ball thing. So is 2 kilometers the sweet spot in terms of draw distance? Maybe, maybe not. For example, if players in a next-generation Mutable Cube World game were to try to recreate the statue of Christ the Redeemer, they would want their statue to be visible from as much as 16 kilometers away, because that's how far away you can see it in real life. And what's more, in video games generally, we try to make things larger than life. So we really have no clue when we'll have enough of a draw distance, and we really have no clue whether or not this will even be technologically possible. But it's worth trying to achieve. Now, you may be asking yourself, wait a sec, Chris. We've been putting 3D models on computer games for 2 decades now. So why don't we just use the various techniques and approaches that we already know? Unfortunately, if you were to sit down and look at the past 2 decades of computer games programming knowledge, the sort of advanced techniques used in state-of-the-art engines like Source or CryEngine, you would find that the majority of the findings would be completely inapplicable for an MCG. That's because MCGs are weird. A scene in a normal computer game is composed of a small number of objects. These objects often have complex shapes, and they can be at any position or orientation. And if you want an object to be bigger, you can just sort of mark that object as being bigger. Conversely, a mutable cube world game has a very large set of objects, but all of these objects are the exact same size and shape. And generally, you don't even need to record where the objects are, but instead you can infer the position of the object by using its location in the computer's memory list. So here is sort of how a normal game scene is structured in the computer. It's a list of different objects and where they are. Conversely, here's how a scene is structured in a mutable cube world game. There's only a tiny chunk of memory given to each block, and we know where the block belongs without any sort of annotation. For this reason, you really do have to take completely different approaches from programming a mutable cube world game. It's around the 17-minute mark, so let me give a quick summary of what I've said in these past two parts. Mutable cube world games are games that are like Minecraft. Because these games offer a completely new form of gameplay, they have the potential to get really big and to get really profitable. Unfortunately, mutable cube world games are pretty challenging to make, and that challenge comes from the strange way that they store the data that comprises their world. For my next section of the video, I'll be talking about how the technology of mutable cube world games can be enhanced. I'll be doing this with a special emphasis on draw distance, which in my mind is the most important performance improvement. Part 3. Pushing it to the limit. We now see the demand for a technologically sophisticated mutable cube world game, one that offers faster performance and therefore a greater draw distance. Hardware to offer faster performance is already on its way, but on the software front, I don't believe enough is being done. I'm going to look under the hood and show you two big ways that modern 3D games improve their graphical performance. From there, we'll look at how these techniques could be adapted to an MCG. The first is called level of detail optimization, in which we change the shape of distant objects to make them easier for the computer to draw. The second is called the potentially visible set problem, in which we try to prevent the computer from drawing objects that are not visible. Level of detail is very intuitive, and anyone who has ever seen a low-resolution image can understand how it works. When an object is far away, the computer can get away with drawing it at a significantly reduced level of detail. The fundamental appearance is preserved, but it makes for less work done by the computer. Here's a screenshot of the game Crisis, in which this rack of oil drums uses only an eighth as many polygons when it was just a few more meters away. With few exceptions, level of detail is really hard to notice. One of my favorite examples is the 15-year-old game Diddy Kong Racing. When characters are more than just a few feet in front of you, their model gets switched with just a pyramid, but it's almost impossible to see. Now, what if we wanted to implement a level of detail optimization on a mutable cube world game? Well, that's challenging. First off, we would not have an artist who could double-check the low detail versions of whatever our algorithm makes in order to verify that they're accurate. Secondly, using a naive approach, such as lumping blocks together in a 3D mesh and just using the existing level of detail algorithms, may actually increase the memory footprint beyond its current state. We also want to maintain the blocky aesthetic, rather than take hills and turn them smooth. And lastly, we have a problem in that the blocks, being elemental types, can't really be merged in the same way that a pixel or a voxel can. All that said, you intuitively would think that it's possible to express any shape in a simplified form, even if it's made from a discrete number of fixed-size pieces. You can see this demonstrated by this series of images of a spaceship from Star Wars being made of successively lower and lower numbers of Lego pieces. One approach to the level of detail problem can be found in the game Sea of Memes, developed by an independent developer named Micheal Goodfellow. I had the honor of talking to Micheal Goodfellow about the ways he is optimizing the game. In addition to merely optimizing for graphical performance, he is also looking to make his game work as an online game with low server expenses. The first way Micheal tried to create an LOD was by taking cube-shaped groupings of blocks and fusing them together into a single large block. Whichever type of block constituted the most blocks in this grouping would be the type of the big block. This looked to be a fairly obvious solution. Unfortunately, the end result was not very good. It looked bad. This approach wiped out the details and was marked by abrupt transitions between the levels of detail, and it was a lot harder to gauge how far away the blocks were. Lastly, the resulting volumes were just too big, which overall increased the volume of the landscape. Micheal fixed these problems with his second LOD system. Here, he had the cubes shrink until they were only as long, tall, and wide as the cubes they enveloped. Additionally, rather than reducing the cubes down to a single cube, the technique instead changes the side of each block to a snapshot of the block as viewed from that angle. The result of this is a lot more accurate, and it's much less obvious when the user moves to a lower level of detail. Here you can see a scene with an airplane being reduced to a lower level of detail, but many aspects of the scene are still preserved. The wings are only a little bit fatter than they were previously, and the stripes on the plane have been kept intact. The object is clearly recognizable. If you look at the ground, you can see that it is now composed of a small number of very large blocks. I personally didn't notice this until Goodfellow pointed it out to me. Sea of Memes' level of detail system allows it to render much larger areas without a great increase in computational expense, or a truly great loss in visual authenticity. Here's a scene that can be rendered in real time. Look at those draw distances. I think that the next Mutable Cube World game will have something implemented along these lines. The second way to speed up a Mutable Cube World game is by computing a thing called the potentially visible set. Once you've done that, the computer will only draw and only think about drawing objects which are possible to see. If an object is behind a wall or covered up by something, it gets excluded from the PVS. This effect dramatically increases the performance of the game. Now, a game's PVS computation is normally invisible to the viewer because objects are only treated as outside of the PVS once they are completely covered up by something and thus not visible. Duh. But if you play a game on wireframe mode, you'll get the ability to see through walls, which allows you to see the PVS system at work. Here's some footage of the game Portal 2, where you can see huge chunks of the scene appearing and disappearing depending on whether or not they are potentially visible. Now, for comparison, I'll show you what Minecraft looks like in its equivalent to Minecraft mode. Here's a scene from within a cave. And here's the same scene viewed in wireframe mode. Minecraft has no PVS computation at all, so any surface that could be visible from anywhere in the scene is being drawn. So what does Portal have that Minecraft doesn't? Every game that computes the potentially visible set does so using a data structure called a bounding volume hierarchy. Essentially, a bounding volume hierarchy, or BVH, gives you a branching description of which spaces in the world own which other subspaces. At the topmost level, you have the entire game world, which is split up into small sections, which in turn split up into even smaller sections. And at the lowest level, you have individual objects. This allows the computer to make conclusions based on the higher levels of the hierarchy. This is a somewhat unintuitive concept, so I'll make it more clear with some examples. Okay, let's say I live in Alameda, California, and I want to figure out which of my friends on this list lives closest to me. This is a spatial computation problem. Now, I could check each and every one of them one by one every time I want to see who I'm closest to, or I could organize these people and their locations using a sort of hierarchical scheme. So now I have this tree of groups and subgroups of my friends. Since I want to find who lives closest to me, I narrow my search down to Americans. I narrow it further into Californians, and from there I go with people who live in LA. From there, I only need to compare the people who live in Los Angeles, and out of those two, I picked my pal Shigeru. Okay, these categorizations are basically a sort of bounding volume hierarchy. Here's another example. Take a look at the scene on the right. I'm interested in determining which objects the stick figure man could possibly be looking at. Because I've already built a bounding volume hierarchy, this won't require too many computations. At the topmost level of the hierarchy, I have the contents of this picture divided into the sky and front yard, the backyard, and the interior of the house. Now I go down a level in the hierarchy and build up a potentially visible set. Because the backyard is on the other side, for example, I can skip it and its subsections, and all of its contents, including the cat, doghouse, and ball. Bounding volume hierarchies work so well that they are in pretty much every 3D game nowadays. So why don't we adopt the same scheme for a mutable cube world game? There's two big problems with attempting to create a bounding volume hierarchy in a mutable cube world game. The first is that the world is constantly changing. In the man and house example, we've built everything under the assumption that the man can't see inside of the house. But if the man were to punch a hole in the wall, like you can with Minecraft, then the BVH would need to be completely restructured. Similarly, we can't just keep it the same because it just won't work. The second is that a normal 3D game is a sparse data set. It's basically a list and a description of objects as well as their position in space. There's an infinite number of shapes something can have, and there's an infinite number of positions. A mutable cube world is the opposite of sparse. Rather than listing shapes and the positions of the objects, the data structure for a mutable cube world game basically just counts each and every cubic meter of space and says what material is inside it. So what solutions do we have towards making a bounding volume hierarchy? Currently none, but I'll go through a solution that, very likely, will be tried in the coming years. Rather than describe it explicitly, I'll explain the steps one would take in order to do it. So first, you make a second copy of the game world, and we'll call this copy the cliff note, because I haven't come up with enough terms in this video yet. Next, with the cliff note, take any block that is not exposed to air, and therefore invisible, and set it to be air. Essentially, you want to hollow out the landscape. Now, provided that the mutable cube world represents actual real-world scenes and landscapes, and therefore has solids comprised of many blocks, you should end up with a sparse data set that is mostly empty. This means that we can store the cliff note representation of the world in a type of bounding volume hierarchy called an octree. An octree is a bounding volume hierarchy scheme where the bounding volumes are cubes. Each cube splits into sets of 8 cubes with half the scale. As with all bounding volume hierarchies, we can now skip entire sections of the graph. Notice that, although we are storing every surface exposed cube, there are many volumes in the octree that do not have any subdivisions. Here, some of the yellow blocks consist only of air. When we go down to the next level of depth, some of the green blocks, similarly, are only having empty air. So what would the advantages of this approach be? it would likely make it much faster to compute the potentially visible set. But there's also some side benefits. It takes up less space in memory and loads faster than the actual cube world. What this means is that for sections of the world which are kilometers away, we can load the cliff note instead of the actual world because we only need to see them and not interact with them. A side benefit is that we'll be able to simplify calculations pertaining to things like physics, AI, and lighting. Now keep in mind, we can't use this as a wholesale replacement for the original world's data organization. Otherwise, we won't be able to remove blocks and the game will no longer be a mutable cube world game. There's only one disadvantage to use this technique, and it may be enough of a disadvantage to make the technique unfeasible for a long time. The cliff note has to be recomputed every time a block is added or removed. It may not be that big of a deal, though. Blocks rarely get added or removed at a rate of more than 1 or 2 blocks a second, according to some estimations that I've done, and that should be more than enough of a time window to complete the computation. Now, I'm almost done talking about optimizations you can do to a mutable cube world game right now, but I'm going to mention one more that you won't be able to do for a while, and presently, it's not even an optimization at all. It's called ray tracing. I think a lot more people know about ray tracing than they do about things like level of detail and BVH, but I'm going to make the case that, in the future, mutable cube world games will be among the first games to be ray traced. Ray tracing is actually pretty simple. Essentially, for each pixel on the screen, you shoot a vision beam and see what things it hits. You can add additional beams to cover phenomena like lighting, reflections, refractions, and softer shadows. Currently, it's being used for 3D movies, but maybe someday it will be used for games. Now, the performance of ray tracing is based on the number of rays that you shoot out, that is, the number of pixels on the screen, and the computational complexity of tracing that ray. Meanwhile, the traditional way to draw a scene is with a thing called rasterization. With rasterization, the amount of time to draw a scene depends mostly on the number of polygons in that scene. Ray tracing works better when you have hardware specifically designed for it, but today's GPU chips are quickly becoming good at ray tracing themselves. The reason I think mutable cube world games are well suited to ray tracing is because at higher draw distances, you end up with vastly more polygons being drawn than there are pixels on the screen. Secondly, because all of the objects being drawn are cubes, the geometry calculations are a lot simpler. And lastly, because mutable cube world games already look like they are a decade and a half old, the developer of an MCG can conceivably cut down the resolution of the game and therefore the number of rays being shot. The arrival of ray tracing may come sooner than we think because of a number of factors related to the hardware. There will soon be general-purpose graphical processing units, or GPGPUs, cloud gaming, in which most of the computations to run a game are provided over the internet, could become more popular. And lastly, the next generation of Xbox and PlayStation consoles may be up to the task of performing ray tracing in real time. If you want to know more about ray tracing and how it could conceivably be applied to a mutable cube world game, I'd recommend looking at the work being done by Nvidia researcher Samuli Laine. He worked on a very similar problem called voxel rendering, and managed to make a program that performs ray tracing at real-time speeds. If you recall Octrees from a few slides ago, it's what he uses, only with a clever packing scheme. Some of the things that will be easier to do with ray tracing are things like sunsets, light beams, reflective water, and a larger number of light sources. Here's a quick recap of the points I made in Chapter 3. I reported on 3 major improvements that could be made to mutable cube world game engines. These are level of detail optimization, bounding volume hierarchies, and ray tracing. Okay, part 4, the real deal. Ugh, what an adventure that was. But here's the takeaway point that I want to give. I just spent a half an hour talking about the problems of mutable cube world games. But it's my belief that game developers will be able to find really good solutions to the problems of MCGs, given that they put in the time, energy, and talent. It will be a long time before a golden solution to the problem of MCGs is found, and during this time, there will be an arms race to make the most technologically sophisticated MCG. I think the markets will push things in the right direction, and over the next 10 years, we'll see some really fantastic games. But if developers and the public fail to understand the problems of MCGs, then the future of the genre will be characterized by confusion, doubt, inefficacy, and dishonesty. With the global games industry pulling in tens of billions of dollars annually, I'd say there's a lot at stake. I recommend, then, that the games industry implements a set of standards by which they can objectively evaluate the technological sophistication of their mutable cube world game products, and that industry pundits educate themselves on MCGs and how they can be advanced and demonstrated, and also how someone could make a fake MCG to deliberately mislead customers. Here's a quick list of things that you should look for in a mutable cube world game if you want to be sure that it's the real deal. I give it the acronym DLITS. D is for distances. You want to be sure that the game allows you to see the world and the player constructions from a long way away. L is for lighting. If you see that environments and player-created buildings look naturally and smoothly lit, then you have some evidence that the game engine already has its essential technical challenges out of the way, and that its performance will be up to par. I is for interaction. You want to see changes being made to the world. You want these changes to look natural, and you want to see that it's possible to do a lot of interaction in the game. T is for travel. If, in a demo, the player is able to move around quickly over large distances, it's a good sign that the game is ready to handle big worlds in a stable way. Lastly, S is for scenes. If you hope to build a city in an MCG, don't be satisfied with any demonstrations unless you actually see a city being built. It's important that people are skeptical about promises being made about what a technology can do. I encourage viewers to write to the big companies and tell them that mutable cube world games are something that you'd really like to see more of. I encourage you to support things that look like they might be rip-offs or clones of Minecraft, because it really is a genre with a lot of room for advancement. Give support to smaller developers, but do so cautiously and make sure that they're making responsible design decisions. If you have any questions about this subject, you can email me at conlon, CONLON, CS @wustl.edu. And if you want to hear more about this, then please check out the sites that I've listed as references. I hope you've enjoyed the video and had as much fun and learned as much as I did making it. See you later, and remember, knowledge is power.